Hello, welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. We're in Ruth Chapter 2. It's the second part of our series on the Book of Ruth called Fields of Grace. Ruth is a love story, and it's in Chapter 2 that the romance really kicks in. Romance is important, isn't it? And romance is popular. Between 2019 and 2024, that 4-year period, sales of romantic fiction in the UK more than doubled because people love a love story, and we've got a great love story here. It's not so much boy meets girl as widowed, destitute foreign woman meets wealthy businessman who happens to be related to her mother-in-law. It's a great story. I hope you'll stay with it, not just this week, but for the 2 weeks that follow as well. This chapter has 3 lessons in love, which I'd like us to focus on today. They're themes that you'll find in many romantic stories, and the first one is generosity, because this is a story, as so many are, about a wealthy man and a poor woman falling in love. So theme number 1, a love that is generous. We read today that Boaz is a wealthy man. He's a man of standing, and Ruth was so poor that she was reduced to picking up the waste that was left by the harvesters after they'd finished their job. Reminds me of films that I've seen of people scrabbling around slag heaps in coal towns for this coal that's been thrown away by other people in order to heat their homes. People who are living on the things that are left as valueless by other members of society. That's what Ruth was doing at this point. Now, Boaz was obliged to allow the poor to gather what was left after the harvest. That's in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. But he didn't just do that. He did more than that as well. He gave her community. He allowed her to mix with the other women. He gave her protection from his own men and from the workers for other parties as well. He gave her water. How valuable was that in a hot climate? He also prayed for her. He didn't just give her things, he prayed for her. He gave her rest. He gave her bread. He gave her more than she could accept. And rather than just let her have the leftovers after the harvesters had finished, he allowed her to pick before and during the harvest as well. So look at all these ways in which Boaz not only gave out of what was spare, but he gave out of what he would have been entitled to keep himself. He went beyond what was his duty and was much more generous. He gave not only of his financial wealth, but of his time and his power. He quite clearly cared. Boaz's behaviour foreshadows the generosity shown by God to us through Christ. He gives far more than he has to, far more than we could ever merit. We learn a lot in our series on Ephesians that's just finished about grace. And I was reminded by somebody that grace is a handy acronym, GRACE, God's riches at Christ's expense. God's riches at Christ's expense marks God's generosity to us, and Boaz's generosity to Ruth foreshadows that generosity as an example that we can follow amongst ordinary people. For example, look in verse 18. Ruth was given more than she could eat, and that's a generosity that reminds me of the feeding of the 5,000 when all that food was left over at the end. Or it reminds me of my cup runneth over, as it says in Psalm 23. Or of God being able to give us far more than we could ever ask for in Ephesians chapter 3. Or as a second example, look at verse 9. Boaz tells Ruth, whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink. And that reminds me of Jesus saying, come to me, all who are thirsty, and I will give them drink. So in all these ways, Boaz is foreshadowing the generosity of God through Jesus. But he doesn't just foreshadow the way Jesus is going to behave. He foreshadows how we should behave to other people, because we are called as followers of Jesus to be generous people. Look at what the Israelites were told in Deuteronomy chapter 15. If among you one of your brothers becomes poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord is giving you, you should not harden your heart to them or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you should open your hand to him and lend him everything he needs. We're told in 2 Corinthians 9 that we're to be cheerful givers, not giving out of compulsion, but giving happily. And think about the story in Luke chapter 21, when Jesus is watching lots of people give their offerings, and he sees wealthy people giving a lot of money out of their spare cash, and he sees a very poor woman giving almost everything that she's got from the money that she owns. And it's her that he commends as being generous, because generosity is about going beyond what we should do to be doing what we could do. Generosity is about giving more than we are needed to give, but giving what we can give as well. What is it that you could do to be more generous this week to reflect these examples set by Boaz and by Jesus? Note also that Boaz prayed that God would bless Ruth, but then Boaz was willing to be the blessing himself. Boaz was willing to pray for Ruth, that asking God to bless her, but then he was willing to be the blessing himself. We have received with grace and generosity, and we should also give with the same approach. Our attitude shouldn't be, what's the least I can give and still get away with being compliant and being a good boy and girl, but rather to be, what's the most I can give in order to please other people? What can we do this week which helps us comply with God's new attitude of generosity as shown by Boaz and Jesus? True generosity, doing more than we need to. So that's theme 1, a love that is generous. Theme 2, again we see it in lots of romance novels, a love that welcomes foreigners. Let me start by telling you a love story about 2 people I used to know. When we lived in Blackburn, we were first married, we knew Roy and Ilsa. Ilsa was a lovely woman. She loved to bake, and she was a very good baker. She looked after our budgie when we went on holiday, and she babysat our eldest when he was born as well. This was hard for Ilsa because she had her own son, Kevin, but he died in his early 20s, and this was a struggle for her and for Roy, who she loved dearly, and Roy loved her. Roy struggled with his mental health occasionally, and Ilsa would lovingly care for him. Ilsa had come to England after the war as a young woman in search of a better life. She was German. She retained her German accent with which she would deliver East Lancashire idioms, and it was very amusing. But partly because she kept her German accent, everybody knew that she was German, and there were people in Blackburn who were very happy to remind her that she was German, a country with which 40 years previously we had been at war, and many of us had known friends or distant relatives who had died in that war at the hands of the Germans or the war previously. And there were plenty of people who would not see beyond Ilsa's Germanness to see the wonderful person that there was there. Roy could see beyond it, and Roy loved her dearly. And that reminds us of the way Boaz could see beyond the fact that Ruth was a Moabitess, and he could see the woman himself. Because Ruth and Naomi were, after all, economic migrants. Remember from last week that Naomi had left Israel when the going got tough to seek food in Moab, a nation with whom Israel had been recently at war. And then when Israel's famine was over, at least 10 years later, she and Ruth came back looking for a better life. They had nothing to offer economically. They were here for what they could get. And Ruth had come from a nation that was repeatedly been at war with Israel. Note how throughout the book of Ruth, Ruth is always referred to primarily as the Moabitess, as the woman from Moab. And that's before she's referred to as being Naomi's daughter-in-law or Mahlon's widow. The first characteristic is nearly always the Moabitess. And it clearly stuck because in verse 10 of chapter 2, she sees herself as a foreigner. But then, straight after in verse 11, Boaz sees her as a person for who she is and for what she's done. He knows how loyal she's been to Naomi. He sees beyond the stereotype of her nationality and sees the person. In the same chapter where Boaz and other people had been told to allow poor people to pick up after the harvest is done, in that same chapter they're also told this: do not mistreat foreigners who are living in your land. Treat them as you would an Israelite and love them as you love yourselves. Remember that you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Boaz's behaviour foreshadows the welcome that God gives to us through Christ. It says in Romans chapter 5 that while we were enemies, God reconciled us to him through the death of his son. So Boaz shows us what Jesus was like in this recognition of foreigners, and he shows us how we should behave too in our acceptance of foreigners as well. Now, this is not a party political message. You're entitled to hold any views you like on immigration or migration or the movement of workers across international boundaries. There will be different views on immigration and nationalism within our congregation, all of them sincerely held by people who follow Jesus. I've seen Bible verses used to underpin very different policies on this area. There are 2 key points here, though. When we disagree, we should disagree with each other with love and respect and hearing each other, and with generosity. We should seek to understand each other. And we should understand that this is a complex issue, and simplistic, emotive slogans from either side of the argument are unlikely to be helpful. But if we are followers of Jesus, if we're children of the living God, then the principles on which our opinions and behaviours are based must be a Christ-like love for other people, loving our neighbours as ourselves, regardless of where they come from, to see the people above the politics. I'm struck how God reminds the Israelites that they were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. And for those of us of this generation who are British and who were born here, then we've not experienced for many, many generations any time when people in Britain, or many people in Britain, have been forced to flee from fear. So we find that perhaps hard to relate to, but we've seen plenty of people who move abroad to find a better life. And we mustn't forget that other people move here to find a better life. And we must ask ourselves, is our attitude based accurately on the example of Boaz? Is it based on the example and teaching of Christ about how we should behave towards foreigners? So there's two lessons in love from Ruth. We've had a love that welcomes foreigners, and a love that is generous. The third one is a love that brings comfort and peace in times of turmoil. Naomi and Ruth were suffering personal turmoil, even though this was a time of peace and prosperity. There was no more war with Moab at the time, and the famine was over. But we read last week in chapter 1 that Naomi considered herself to be bitter, empty and afflicted. Ruth was clearly poor and destitute. She was living off scraps and waste. But we read that it was the arrival of a Redeemer that brought them comfort in verse 13, and indeed renewed hope in verse 20. This is the clearest example yet of Boaz foreshadowing Christ, because he is explicitly referred to as a kinsman redeemer, and it was the Redeemer that brought comfort. The word translated as comforted in verse 13 in the NIV is nacham in Hebrew, and it's a word that's used repeatedly in the Old Testament to denote peace and respite in or after a time of trouble. Here's some examples. In Genesis chapter 24, Isaac is distraught following the death of his mother, but it says he finds comfort when he marries Rebekah. In Genesis chapter 37, Jacob is distraught and in turmoil when he believes Joseph, his son, has died, and people try to comfort him, to offer him nacham. And in Ezekiel chapter 14, God says there will be comfort for the survivors following the destruction of Israel. That's comfort and peace following a time of turmoil. It's a word then for relief, comfort and peace during or after times of personal turmoil. And even in times of national peace and prosperity, there will always be personal tragedy and strife. At times when everybody seems to be joyful, some people will be struggling with sadness. That's quite normal. But we can find comfort and peace. Where do we look for it? If you talk to your friends about what is peace, we commonly get three kinds of answers. Peace can be an absence of fighting, an absence of war, and that's peace. And that's a good thing, isn't it? It's an absence of peace. An absence of war is a good thing. You could also, if people want peace and quiet, you will say, well, it's an absence of noise, an absence of busyness. And that also is a good thing, and that's peace. And if it's about inner peace, then we'll say, well, it's an absence of anxiety or stress or interpersonal conflict. All these things are great. We would all be better if we could have more of them. But look how they're all marked by absences. They're marked by a negative. And that means that if we're trying to pursue that peace, we have to look at being on the run from things in our life, to run away from war and run away from noise and run away from interpersonal trouble in order for us to find peace. It also means that our peace is subject to changing circumstances, because we're not always in control of those things. But what if peace from a Redeemer is a presence, not an absence? It was the arrival in their lives of a Redeemer that brought peace and comfort to Naomi and Ruth. Because God's peace is different to the world's peace, because it's not characterised by an absence, it's characterised by a presence. We can find peace in our lives by inviting Jesus in. It says repeatedly in John chapters 14, 15 and 16 that the Holy Spirit is the comforter. If we want comfort and peace that will not be subject to circumstances changing, that will stay despite turmoil and strife, then we get that by finding the presence of Jesus, not just the absence of war, turmoil and noise. I told you that at the start that in the 5 years up to 2024, romance fiction had doubled its sales, more than doubled its sales. At the same time, sales of the Bible doubled, because people don't just want to read about love, people want to read about God's love. What have we learned about God's love today? In Ruth Chapter 2, we've learned 3 things. We've learned that God's generosity should lead his followers to be generous to others. We've learned that God's welcome should lead his followers to be welcoming to others. And we've learned that God's peace that brings comfort is not as the world gives, because it's a presence. It's the presence of the Redeemer in our lives and not just an absence of things we don't like.